April 21, 1943, islands 2200 hours, the pilot climbed. Into his seat, ran his pre-flight checks, and looked through the cockpit glass at the runway stretched out ahead. Of him, he had flown from Hawaii to this tiny dot of land 2 days earlier. More than 2,600 miles of featureless Pacific, and what he saw when he arrived had shaken him. The runway lay on a strip of coral so narrow that both edges ended at the waterline. There was no margin, no shoulder, no tolerance for error, just the runway, then the sea. If this thing isn't what they say it is, we're done. Before we start, his B-24 Liberator sat loaded with bombs, fuel topped to the brim, and 10 men aboard. At maximum takeoff weight, nearly 60,000, this four-engine giant would thunder down the coral's surface and have to be airborne before the reef shelf dropped into the Pacific. The ocean wasn't a distant hazard, it was a wall at the end of the road. There were 23 of these aircraft waiting to fly that night, 23 Liberators. Of the 11th Bombardment Group lined up wing towing on a runway that American Navy had built from nothing, literally from the crushed remains of the coral island itself in barely 6 months. 6 months earlier, this island had been coconut palms and dense brush. There had been no runway, no fuel tanks, no radar installation, no pontoon piers. No base at all, just a sliver of coral in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth, 700 m southeast of the Japanese garrison on 2,600 m from Hawaii, and 1,100 m east of the Solomon Islands, a nothing place, a nowhere place until the U.S. Navy decided to turn it into a weapon. The story of is not about a famous battle, no fleet engagement happened here, no legendary commander walked this beach. What happened here was quieter, more methodical, and in many ways decisive. A group of construction workers from naval construction battalions transformed one of nature's most fragile landforms into a strategic spear pointed directly at Japan's Pacific perimeter. They built a fully operational air and naval base capable of launching these 60,000 heavy bombers on a strip of coral barely wider than a city block, using the island itself as their primary building material. The military planners called it an advanced base. The pilots who flew from it called it something less printable, but the Japanese never called it anything because for 6 months they didn't know it existed. This strategic blind spot, this incredible secret, was a testament to American ingenuity and critical turning point. If you're enjoying this story, please support us with a like and subscribe for more untold stories. Now back to that monumental oversight and its profound consequences. That oversight would cost them dearly. October 2, 1942. Lagoon dawn. 11 ships of the United States Navy entered the lagoon in the early morning light. It was a significant armada for such an insignificant-looking place. Destroyers, transports, and support vessels, all materializing from the pre-dawn darkness to deliver the men and machinery that would transform this. The operation had a code name, Fetlock. The mission was classified. The local islanders, most of whom spoke English, learned from London Missionary Society teachers, watched from shore as the Americans began to come ashore. The landing force included the U.S. Marine Corps 5th Defense Battalion. Their job was to protect whatever the Navy was about to build, along with a detachment of the 2nd Naval Construction Battalion. These were the Seabees, the Navy's builders. Their motto was "We build, we fight." In the Pacific, the emphasis had been on the first half. The strategic logic behind was straightforward, even if the geography was not. Japan had swept through the Central Pacific in late 1941 and early 1942 with terrifying speed. By December 1941, in the Gilbert Islands was in Japanese hands. By mid-1942, their garrisons formed a defensive arc through the Gilberts and Marshalls, protecting the inner ring of their Pacific empire. American planners in Honolulu stared at the map and saw the problem clearly. To push northwest toward Japan's home islands, they would need to crack through that arc, and to do that, they needed bases from which to project air power north deep into the Gilberts. Sat 700 m southeast of, in Pacific terms, that was close. Critically, its vast lagoon, roughly 13 mi long and 10 mi wide, could shelter an entire fleet. The lagoon offered anchorage for up to 100 ships, and the calm and closed water could support sea planes and PT boats that the open Pacific swell would otherwise make impossible to operate. What the lagoon could not offer was solid ground. Its landmass is not a single island, but a ring of tiny coral islets perched atop an ancient reef formation. The main islet is barely 400 m wide at its broadest point, and far narrower along most of its length. It is composed entirely of calcium carbonate coral deposited over By the polyps that built the reef beneath it. This material has no deep roots into bedrock. There is no bedrock below the coral aggregate lies ocean. The entire landmass is in effect a thin crust resting atop the Pacific. The CBS looked at this and were not deterred. The 2nd Naval Construction Battalion's detachment numbered a few hundred men equipped with bulldozers, road graders, coral crushers, and the kind of practical construction expertise that the Navy had gone to extraordinary lengths to assemble in a hurry since Pearl Harbor. They were not explorers, they were builders with a blueprint and a deadline, and neither the landscape nor the geology was going to move the deadline. Within hours of the landing, bulldozers were ashore and men were already felling coconut palms. The runway they needed had to run the full length of maximizing available distance before the coral shelf dropped away into the lagoon. Trees came down by the thousands. A swampy bog near the island's center had to be partially filled. The coral surface beneath was graded and compacted, material from the lagoon floor hauled ashore and crushed to specification. By November 1942, just 6 weeks after the landing, the first aircraft could use the new strip. It was 5,000 long, barely adequate coral crowned slightly in the middle for drainage. No taxiways, no revetments, no permanent lighting. It was the minimum viable runway built on minimum viable real estate in minimum viable time. Americans were not alone in the work. Local islanders who had helped unload ships and clear brush during the initial days continued to assist. Many spoke English, all knew this terrain intimately. Their cooperation and labor appeared repeatedly in unit logs with genuine appreciation. One account noted they had worked themselves to near exhaustion helping the arriving forces unload gear from the landing vessels. By December 1942, a small hospital had been completed on the island. PT boats arrived to run patrol missions in the lagoon. 4 VA Kingfisher float planes arrived on December 15th to begin anti-patrols over the surrounding ocean. Radar was installed. Plans for the aviation fuel farm were drawn up. The Japanese still didn't know any of it existed. January through March 1943 at Hull. Through the early months of 1943, the base continued to grow in secrecy. The CBS worked under conditions that would have broken ordinary men. The equatorial sun heated tools so quickly that metal became untouchable by morning. In the afternoon, rain came without warning, flooding the runway apron before evaporating in minutes and leaving behind a humid, suffocating heat that was, if anything, worse than the direct sun. Salt was everywhere in the air, on the equipment, in the food. Supply ships arrived from Hawaii and Samoa carrying fuel, lumber, ammunition, and parts for equipment already damaged by the corrosive marine environment. At one point, a Japanese air raid alert sent a supply vessel fleeing the lagoon before it could be fully unloaded, leaving them without proper rations for weeks. They survived on Vienna sausage. And the engineers had also discovered, working with the coral material, a fundamental truth about the island beneath their feet. Coral aggregate was not soil. It did not compact or drain the way that conventional runways required. Coral is primarily a skeletal material, porous, angular, prone to pulverizing under heavy loads into a fine silt that behaves like loose powder under compression. Process it correctly with the proper gradation and moisture content, and the calcium carbonate acts as a natural binder. Self under compaction. Process it incorrectly, or allow rain to leach the fine particles before they can cure and the surface stays loose, ruts under weight, and fails. The Seabees' initial 5,000 strip had been constructed correctly, enough for the lighter aircraft already using it, but in April 1943 the 2nd Naval Construction Battalion received new orders: extend the runway to 6,600. B-24 Liberator heavy bombers were coming. These aircraft loaded to nearly 60,000 at maximum takeoff weight, powered by 4 Whitney R-1830 engines producing 1,200 horsepower each, required not just more runway, but surface that could withstand repeated punishment from main gear loads that would destroy an improperly prepared base. The construction crews went back to work dredging fresh coral aggregate from the lagoon floor, crushing it, grading it to specification, building the extension in layers. By April 1943, the strip reached 6,600 2,000 m with steel mat pierced steel planking laid over critical sections to distribute aircraft weight across a larger surface area and protect the coral base beneath from the concentrated loading of heavy aircraft. Meanwhile, the strategic picture north of the equator was coming into sharper focus. American and Allied forces had ground down Japan's offensive momentum through the brutal fighting in the Solomons at Tamil at New Georgia, in the skies above both islands through 1942. And into 1943, the momentum was shifting slowly and at terrible cost. Planners at Admiral's headquarters in Hawaii were now looking north toward the Gilberts with concrete intent. Tarawa had to fall, but to invade Tarawa, they needed weeks of sustained heavy bomber attack to degrade Japanese defenses, and to sustain that campaign, they needed a base within strike range. Well within striking range of island was the only answer the map offered. The CBS had been building toward this moment without fully knowing it. The whole Pacific War was converging on their runway. What the men building that runway could not see because no one outside of operations staff could see it yet was the precise shape of what they were enabling. The Gilbert Islands campaign that would use as its air power foundation wasn't formally approved until the summer of 1943. The CBS, who extended the strip to 6,600 in April of that year, were building to requirements handed down from above following orders that spoke of bomber requirements and fuel capacities, but said nothing about Tarawa, nothing about the November invasion date that was already being calculated in planning rooms in Pearl Harbor and Washington. They extended the runway, built the fuel farm, repaired the radar mast after the first Japanese raid, filled the bomb craters in the strip between operations, and kept building. The garrison on this speck of coral had grown to include Army Air Forces personnel, Navy support staff, Marines running the anti-aircraft guns, and the CB construction crews, all packed onto an island whose widest point you could walk across in 5 minutes. It was crowded, exposed, and in intermittent communication with the wider world via radio traffic that was monitored for brevity and operational security. The base held together because the men in it understood their function. Even when they didn't know the plan, they were keeping the runway open. Whatever came next, the runway had to be open. April 17, 1943. Hawaii, Major General H. Hale assembled 23 B-24 Liberators and their crews for the mission briefing. The men heard their objective for the first time. They were flying to. From there, they would mount the first American heavy bomber strikes against Japan's positions in the Gilbert Islands. When the pilots told their crews the destination, most had to look it up on a map. B-24 gunner Sergeant Eade of the 11th Bombardment Group recalled the reaction. The island was halfway to Australia. The journey would take them 1,900 m to Canton Island, where they would refuel, then 740 mi further to more than 2,600 m from Hawaii in total. Not a mission, a migration. They arrived on April 19th after hours of flying over featureless ocean. Aircraft came down onto the coral strip one by one, engines throttling back, wings rocking slightly in the unbroken crosswind that rolled across with nothing to break it for 1,000 miles. Pilots who had trained on paved runways at Wheeler Field found themselves rolling out on a surface that transmitted a different character. Through the landing gear, the compacted coral communicating a faint vibration that was less engineered than geological, the island itself speaking through the wheels. What they found was austere beyond any base most of them had seen. The enlisted crews shared canvas tents without floors or electricity, sleeping on in shelters that offered no real protection from the equatorial heat. Officers had separate tents with electricity from gas-powered generators at least. Equipment for servicing the bombers was barely adequate. A pair of tracked vehicles for towing aircraft and dreadfully slow at hauling fuel. Trailers there was in name only. In reality, field kitchens set up on bare coral. None of this was surprise. The CBS had built what the operational schedule demanded and what the island's geometry allowed. A proper bomber base with hangars, hard stands, and maintenance depots requires flat, stable ground measured in acres. Usable land measured in hundreds of meters of width. You built what the island permitted and you worked with what you had. They parked wing to wing along the strip edge because there were no taxiways. There were few revetments. If Japanese bombers found them here, the aircraft would be sitting targets in a line. The briefing took place outdoors. The air crews sat on felled palm logs arranged like theater seats facing a map where sat bottom right and the target. Island 700 miles to the northwest sat at top center. Major General Hale stood before his men and explained the mission, the longest bombing strike yet launched from the Central Pacific. Staging through a base that 6 months ago had been a coconut plantation, he had led the group here personally from Hawaii. On the night of April 21, 1943, 22 B-24s rolled down the strip. and climbed into the dark Pacific sky. They flew northwest through the night, and in the early hours of April 22 bombed Japan's valuable phosphate producing island and a key logistics node for Central Pacific operations. They returned to the mission. Was a success. That same night the Japanese found them. A Japanese air attack launch from struck the base in the pre-dawn darkness while the exhausted American crews slept. Bombers parked wing-to-wing made a dense, vulnerable target. One B-24 was destroyed, 5 more were damaged. When the damage assessments came in at first light, Major General Hale counted usable aircraft for the scheduled strike. 6 planes had been taken out of the fight in a single night by an enemy who hadn't known the base existed. 24 hours earlier, the attack revealed 3 truths simultaneously. First, worked, its aircraft had struck and returned undetected on the outbound leg. Second, the island's exposed parking arrangements were vulnerability that needed correction. And third, most significantly, the Japanese now knew where the base was. And they would be back. Between March and November 1943, Japanese forces launched 10 separate air raids on from and American 90mm anti-aircraft batteries on the island's perimeter shot down 6 Japanese bombers during these attacks. The war had found and the base was going to have to survive it. It did. Surface struck repeatedly by blast fragments churned by aircraft operating through tropical downpours held, the aggregate properly compacted in, overlaid with steel mat absorbed punishment, and was repaired quickly by the same construction crews who had built it. After snorts each raid, men were back with graders and compactors before the smoke cleared. By May 1943, Marine Fighting Squadron VMF 441 arrived with F-4F Wildcats to provide fighter cover. The base had teeth. Now one raid from the series carried particular consequence. On September 18, 1943, American forces launched coordinated strike using 24 B-24s staged through against Tarawa. Japanese radar detected them on approach. Anti-aircraft fire shot down 2 bombers. The strike hit the airstrip. Fuel stores and ammunition dumps had now been bombed twice from, and the Japanese knew the base existed and roughly where it was. What they could not know was that their attacks on it were achieving almost nothing of lasting effect. Blast craters were filled, the surface regraded, the fuel form was protected, aircraft dispersed, and in November 1943 the base reached the full scale its builders had always been building toward. The United States Army Air Force's 7th Bomber Command established its headquarters at 2 B-24 bombardment groups. The 11th Wing and the 30th Bombardment Group arrived in, began sustained operations against the Gilbert Islands. The target was the date November 20, 1943, Washington, D.C. and the Pacific Theater, 1942. To understand why construction mattered beyond its single island, single campaign, you have to understand the doctrine that drove it and why that doctrine represented a fundamental revolution in how wars could be waged. The prevailing assumption before Pearl Harbor was that America would fight the Pacific War the way European powers had fought their colonial campaigns, from fixed established bases on large stable islands with proper harbor facilities, developed infrastructure and room to build. Midway, Hawaii, the Philippines. These were the assumed anchor points. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines destroyed that framework completely. What replaced it was the advanced base concept, and it changed the nature of Pacific warfare more profoundly than any single weapon system deployed in the theater. Advanced base doctrine held that American forces would project power not from fixed rear echelon positions, but from a chain of small, rapidly constructed forward installations, each leapfrogging the last, each pushing power and naval reach closer to Japan. The enemy would be outbuilt as well as outfought. The key was whether you could create a base faster than the enemy could respond to it. The problem was that this required builders who could operate under conditions that conventional civilian contractors were neither trained for nor willing to accept. In early 1942, the Navy created the Naval Construction Battalions to fill exactly this role. They drew from the construction trades, carpenters, ironworkers, electricians, plumbers, heavy equipment operators, and civil engineers. They were older than the average fighting man, many in their 30s. And they brought to the Pacific something the Navy desperately needed: hard-won practical experience with construction problems. The CBS operated under a philosophy that was both simple and radical. No island is too small, no material too poor, no timeline too short. Every available resource, including the island itself, was a potential building material. At this philosophy encountered its most severe test because the only building material the island offered was the one thing nobody had engineered. Major air base from before, coral aggregate had been used in minor road construction in Pacific territories before the war, but no one had tested it under the repeated concentrated loads of fully laden heavy bombers. The engineering understanding was limited and empirical. The critical insight that made possible was understanding which type of coral to use and how to process it correctly. The 2nd Naval Construction Battalion's engineers determined through careful practical work that coral aggregate functions as a runway base only if properly graded, screened to remove oversized chunks that create dangerous point loads under aircraft tires, and processed to eliminate the finest silt fractions that stay permanently loose. The middle gradations compacted with the right moisture content undergo a natural reaction. The calcium carbonate particles bond under pressure, creating a surface with properties approaching compacted gravel or low-grade concrete. The enemy of this process was the weather. FAFI guaranteed heavy tropical rainfall, rain that strikes freshly compacted coral before the cementing reaction completes, doesn't accelerate the process, it prevents it. The fine particles leach out before they can bond. The surface reverts to a shifting mass. The warfare history network's account of the 11th Bombardment Group's operations at Moa's this plainly. The runway should have been as solid as concrete, but rain prevented the live coral used to build it from curing properly in early operations. This is where the advanced base philosophy proved its value at the molecular level. The CB solution was not to wait for dry weather. There was no dry season on the equator. The coral base was built in stages, each layer given time to cure before the next was added. Over critical sections, the landing threshold, the touchdown zone, steel mat pierced steel planking was laid directly over the coral. This interlocking grid distributed aircraft weight across a larger surface, protecting the base from point loading while the self-reaction continued beneath. The mat meant that even a runway whose base hadn't fully cured could accept aircraft from day one. While the coral strengthened silently below the steel, the runway was not built to be finished. It was built to be functional now and stronger later. This is the core engineering truth of the Pacific Advanced Base Program, and it was established here on this ATL by tradesmen who had never built an airfield from coral before and had no manual to consult. The institutional knowledge that now exists about coral aggregate construction, its gradation requirements, its compaction parameters, its sensitivity to rain during the curing window, was accumulated by men with bulldozers and graders on and the other islands during a war under operational pressure that allowed no margin for extended experimentation. The CBS who followed these first builders onto subsequent arrived with better methods than their predecessors had because their predecessors had made the mistakes and documented what they learned. Institutional memory traveled with the battalions. November 1943 Island. The target, the Battle of, would be remembered as one of the bloodiest 76 hours in Marine Corps history, but before a single Marine stepped into a landing craft, the battle was already being fought from strip, and the results of that campaign were more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. In the weeks before November 20th, 1943, B-24 crews based at flew repeated bombing missions against island, the 11th Wing and 30th Bombardment Group operating under 7th Bomber Command Headquarters, now installed on the island, hits airstrip, fuel dumps, gun positions, and communications infrastructure in a sustained air campaign designed to degrade the defenses the Marines were about to confront. The bombing did measurable damage. Japanese aircraft on were struck and destroyed. Fuel stores were hit, and as Japanese accounts later confirmed, the sustained air pressure from and the newer airfield completed in November 1943, approximately 200 m north of, created weeks of cumulative pressure on the garrison. A Japanese intelligence assessment issued on November 8, 1943 noted a significant increase in American bombing activity across the Gilberts, and the raids were noticed. They were doing work, but defenses had been engineered to absorb exactly this kind of punishment. Rear Admiral KG had overseen more than a year of fortification, pillboxes reinforced with coconut logs and concrete and coral fill, command shelters designed to survive direct hits from the air. He told his men it would take 1,000,000 Americans 100 red years to take Tarawa. The boast was not idle, it reflected the genuine depth of what those defenses presented. When the invasion fleet arrived on November 19th, the pre-invasion bombardment was staggering. Battleships, carrier aircraft, and the land-based bombers of 7th Bomber Command all striking simultaneously. Estimates placed total ordnance dropped on in the 24 hours before the Marines landed at approximately 6 million pounds. It was not enough. On November 20th, the Marines hit the beach. Lower tides than expected left landing craft stranded on the reef. Hundreds of yards from shore, men abandoned their boats and waited, chest-deep water, direct fire from bunkers, whose reinforced construction had absorbed 6 million pounds of explosives without fundamental damage. The first wave took 75% casualties. General Julian Smith's message to his superior was, "Spare and brutal, issue in doubt." The 76 hours that followed were savage and close. Each Japanese position had to be reduced individually. Grenades, satchel charges, flamethrowers at a cost measured in yards and minutes and lives. On the night of November 223, the remaining defenders launched a final charge. By morning, 17 Japanese soldiers survived from a garrison of approximately 4,500. The island was secured, more than 1,000 Americans killed in action, more than 2,000 wounded, 76 hours on 290 acres. When the casualty figures reached the United States, the public reaction was shock and grief in roughly equal measure. The cost of warfare was now visible and unavoidable. Photographs that came back were unlike anything American newspapers had previously published from the Pacific. Bodies in the water at the reef line, Marines lying where they fell on the beach in rows in the shallow approaches. The images forced a confrontation with what the war in the Pacific actually looked like at ground level, not the clean geometry of naval charts, not the distant smudge of ships on a horizon, but this men dead on a beach 2 m long on an island almost no one had ever heard of. The Navy convened boards of inquiry. The Marine Corps debriefed every surviving officer it could reach. War correspondents who had waited ashore with the assault waves filed dispatches that described what pre-invasion bombardment had and had not done. The answer was painful and specific. Sustained bombing from altitude against deeply reinforced fixed positions had limited effect. The Japanese defenders had simply gone underground, waited out the explosions, and come back to their guns, but the strategic machine kept running. Even before last defenders fell, CBS were moving on to the captured strip and beginning repairs. The chain of advanced bases was extending itself in real time. The same men, the same materials, the same methodology that had proven itself at, now turning destroyed Japanese installation into an Allied one. By December 18, a 4,000 fighter runway was ready. By the following weeks, a full 750-foot bomber strip was operational, paved with 10 in of compacted crushed coral mined from the same lagoon environment the CBS had first mastered 14 months earlier. The lessons of reshaped everything that followed. Pre-invasion bombardment was extended in duration and concentrated on specific defensive positions rather than area saturation. Amphibious tractor numbers were increased dramatically. Reconnaissance and tide table accuracy were made operational requirements. The Marine survivors were pulled from the line and given one assignment: trained. The replacements in everything they had learned became a terrible curriculum. The advanced base chain, anchored at and now extending north through the Gilberts, provided the logistical spine for what came next. Marshall Islands campaign launched just 10 weeks after. The Philippine Sea campaign followed, even as the fighting front moved north and the island's direct relevance diminished. Remained a working node in the supply chain, its vast lagoon accepting tankers transferring fuel to fleet oilers which carried it forward into the combat zone, and the Pacific Advanced Base Chain 1942 through 1944. Construction timeline: October 2, 1942, Operation Fetlock, 11 ships, 5th Marine Defense Battalion, 2nd Naval Construction Battalion Detachment land on November 1942, first runway complete, 5,015.24 m of coral aggregate. April 1943, extended to 6,620.13 m overlay on high-stress sections. Aviation fuel farm completed. November 1943, 7th Bomber Command HQ established. 2 full B-24 bombardment groups operational for Operation Galvanic combat operations from April 21 through 22, 1943. First offensive strikes and bombed. Japanese retaliation raid the same night destroys 1 B-24, damages 5 stripped. Repaired and operational the following morning, September through November 1943. Escalating campaign against coordinated September 18 strike 24. B-24's 2 lost to anti-aircraft fire followed by sustained pre-invasion. Bombing under 7th Bomber Command for Operation Galvanic enemy action. Japanese discovery of base delayed until March 27, 1943. 10 air raids followed. Through November 1943, American 9-beam batteries destroyed 6 attacking aircraft across the entire series, Battle of Operation Galvanic, November 20th through 23rd, 1943. American casualties more than 1,000 killed, more than 2,000 wounded in 76 hours on 290 acres. Japanese garrison approximately 4,500 defenders, 17 survived, captured, rebuilt by CBS to 750 bomber runway within weeks. B-24 Liberator, the aircraft that defined the mission, dimensions 110 wingspan, 68 foot length, 4N. Whitney R-1830 engines at 200 horsepower each, standard combat range 2,100 m. Total produced in World War II, 18,489 aircraft, more than any other American warplane. The pilot who looked down the strip on the night of April 21, 1943, who felt the uncertainty of a surface that wasn't quite what he'd been trained for. He flew from something that had no business being what it was. He made it, 22 of them did. They bombed, returned, and the surface held them. Then the Japanese struck that same night, put 6 planes out of action, and within 24 hours, 12 B-24s were taxiing out to bomb Tarawa from the same base that had just absorbed the attack. The CBS repaired the craters and kept the strip open. The war moved on. Never became famous, its runway never made the newsreels. The men who built it didn't receive monuments, and their names weren't in the communiques announcing the fall of. What they received was what builders usually receive, the knowledge that the thing they made worked, that it held under weights it was never supposed to carry, and that men flew from it who would not otherwise have flown at all. The advanced base philosophy those CBS embodied would define the entire closing arc of the Pacific War. In 1944, Navy construction battalions moved 11 million cubic yards of earth and coral to build 6 runways for the B-29s that bombed Japan's home islands. They repaired captured strips under sniper fire so that crippled, limping home from Tokyo could land rather than ditch in the open Pacific, the chain that started in October 1942, extended link by link all the way to the moment the war ended. What this story ultimately reveals is something that does not appear cleanly in casualty counts or production statistics. The Pacific War was won not just by fighting men but by a parallel army of men who understood materials, who knew what coral aggregate would do under load, what rainfall would do to it base, what steel mat would do to a surface that wasn't quite ready. These men were given terrain that didn't suit their purposes and told to make it suit. The tool they used was engineering, and the philosophy that guided it was relentlessly pragmatic. Build what you can build now, protect it while it matures, accept operations from day one and never stop improving. Runway it is still there, it became international airport. After the war and today it serves the small Pacific nation of Tuvalu, the islands renamed upon independence. Fiji Airways flies in twice a week. When no planes are scheduled, locals use the strip as a common area. Cricket matches, walking daily life. A fire engine activates its siren when an aircraft approaches. The original coral aggregate, the second naval construction battalion laid in 1942, lies beneath the modern surface, improved and resurfaced over the decades, but still at its foundation the same work. The ocean is still right there at the edges, exactly where it always was. The runway holds duels com